Welcome to our lesson on the borders of Israel. Now, you may recognize what's indicated in this map called the Spratly Islands if you're from the Philippines, China, Vietnam, or Malaysia, because all those countries, maybe a few more, have a claim on those islands, and they're disputed. China thinks that they are within their borders. The Philippines thinks that the Spratly Islands are within their borders, and so on. So borders do matter, and borders are still fought over even to this day. So that's going to be our lesson for today, the borders of Israel. And there have been three contested areas in Israel and in the modern state of Israel. One being the Gaza Strip that used to belong to Egypt. The second being the West Bank, which used to belong to Jordan. And the third one being the Golan Heights, which used to belong to Syria. Well, let's see what God says about the borders of Israel. And we see in this passage, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." So those are the biblical borders, from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Now, if we look on a map and see where those two locations are, and we'll talk about the river of Egypt in just a little bit, but suffice to say for now, that's to be identified with the Wadi El Arish in the south. And then the Euphrates River, of course, is up in the north. Now, as you look at that, you say, wow, that's way farther north than Israel's borders have ever been. Even in the glory days of David and Solomon, where it extended way up into the north, it really didn't go all the way to the river Euphrates. So many scholars think these are idealized borders, okay? Because later in other passages we'll see there's more specific borders. But if we do look at those passages and try to put together the data, the borders of Israel, with a lot of guesses, because some of the place names that are mentioned in the Bible, we don't know where those are anymore. So we're really guessing as to where those locations are. But the black line here would outline the biblical borders of Israel, which you can see compared to the red dashed line, which is the modern border of Israel. It extends much farther to the north and to the east than the borders do today. Now, the modern borders do extend farther south all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, which probably wasn't in the original borders as designated in the Old Testament. So as we look at the borders of Israel as described in the Bible, I wish I could say there's one definitive set of borders and we can figure them out with certainty. Really, there's some ambiguity, and the only border that we can fix with certainty today is the border on the Mediterranean Sea, and that's pretty easy, to the west. But that's the only one. The other three are hard to determine. Well, what about the Transjordan? Did the borders of Israel cross over the Jordan into the Transjordan? Today, the modern border does not go over to Jordan, and the land of Canaan also did not extend past the past the Jordan River. But we see that 2.5 tribes did settle in the Transjordan. So we have East Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben settling in the Transjordan, And God seemed to be okay with that. He allowed them to stay there. So that's one bit of evidence for that portion being included in the biblical borders of Israel. Secondly, there were cities of refuge in the Transjordan. 3 cities are located there: Golan, Ramoth Gilead, and Bezer. So, since we have cities of refuge there, seems like it's part of the land of Israel. And thirdly, we have Levitical cities in the Transjordan. So if Israel wasn't supposed to be there, why is God appointing Levitical cities there? So as we look at these reasons, I think it's best to conclude that the biblical borders of Israel included the Transjordan. Well, let's talk about the Wadi El Arish, and that was the southern border of Israel. If we look at the lexical data from the Bible and information from the Assyrian records, it's best to conclude that this is the Wadi El Arish, being the river of Egypt and not the Nile River. Israel borders never extended all the way down to the Nile River. So on the basis of the evidence, it's best to conclude that the Wadi El Arish was the southern border for Israel. Well, the borders changed over time as a result of warfare. Warfare often changes the borders of countries. We can see here the kingdom of Saul covering the area in pink there. A couple of exceptions, the circle around Jebus, which had not been captured yet. David would later capture that and rename it as Jerusalem. And then the area around Beit Shan, because the Philistines had a stronghold there. So the Philistines also along the coast, the Phoenicians on the coast farther north. So Saul's kingdom didn't include those areas. But in the days of David and Solomon, the borders were greatly expanded to the south, to the west, to the east, to the north, with the only exceptions being of Philistia and Phoenicia. So these were the glory days of Israel. The borders were at their greatest limits at that time. And then in 931, the 10 northern tribes of Israel split off from the 2 tribes down in the south, which became known as Judah. And so we have the country literally being split in 2, with the kingdom of Israel being in the north and the kingdom of Judah being in the south. And then after Nebuchadnezzar, the Assyrians came and they defeated the kingdom of Israel. We have just Judah is left. And then after King Nebuchadnezzar defeated Judah, later to be called Judea, then really we have no borders for Israel anymore because they are a territory of a larger empire. Well, let's look at the historical background for Israel. If we kind of pick up in the period, the Roman period, just before the birth of Christ and come up to the modern day, we see there's basically 3 Roman periods, 1, 2, and 3, which brings us up to 324. And that's the time when Constantine becomes a believer and the Roman Empire turns Christian. And so that ushers in the Byzantine period up to 640. But then the Byzantines are defeated by the Muslim Arabs, and that ushers in the Arab period in 640. And that extends all the way up to the Crusader period. The Europeans came in, tried to retake Jerusalem and parts of Israel, and those wars went off and on for about 200 years. And then we had the Mamluk period, which they were Muslim rulers, and then the Turkish period, beginning in 1517 with the Ottoman Empire. And notice here that they ruled Israel for 400 years. And so Israel was under Muslim control for 400 years up till World War I, when the British conquered that area, and they were able to control that area from 1917 to 1948. And in 1948, the modern state of Israel was created. Let's talk about the Ottoman Empire a little bit, since they did have control over Israel for 400 years. That's pretty significant. So how did that start? Well, as far back as 1300 AD, we see in modern-day Turkey, their empire started out as indicated in brown, and then expanded to the orange area that we see here, and then over to Greece and Macedonia and other parts of Turkey. And then under Mehmed II, we see an expansion even more in the purple colored areas here. And then in 1520, we see under Selim the First, the borders really expanded, starting to take in parts of Africa. And this is when Israel comes under the Ottoman rule. Okay, so you see there Israel outlined in red. And that continued through Suleiman the Magnificent's reign. He also extended the empire a little bit, and then all the way up to the limits of the Ottoman Empire, which included most of North Africa, the southern coast of Saudi Arabia, and of course Israel. So we see that Israel was under the Ottoman Turks all the way up till World War I. Let's talk about the pre-state of Israel. So before Israel became a state. And there's been a lot of conflict between the Arabs who live there and the Jews. Some of the Jews have been living there for a long time, but many started coming back as a result of some conflicts in Europe and other places. So Jews started flowing into the land in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so this has caused the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. Well, the British mandate at a meeting in 1920 at the San Remo Peace Conference, Great Britain was given the mandate for control over the land of Israel and Jordan, and they called it the Transjordan, and so that was designated as Palestine. But then, not too long after that, in 1921, it was decided that the Arab portion and the Jewish portion would be separated. So they took away the Transjordan from that designation, and the League of Nations approved of that change, and that took effect in 1923. So we have the Israeli section in blue and the Arab Muslim section in orange in this map. And then, just a couple years later, something significant happened. The Golan Heights, which is that narrow piece of land northeast of the Sea of Galilee, there in kind of a maroon color, Britain gave that to the French, who were ruling Syria at the time. So this is how Syria eventually will get control over the Golan Heights. And so that's because in 1923, Britain gave that to them. Well, let's talk about the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1947, the UN came up with a partition plan to divide up the land. And because Great Britain had become quite tired of all the conflict going on in this region between the Arabs and the Jews, and they wanted out. So they were ready to relinquish power to the UN to make a decision concerning the land of Israel. And so the UN decided, well, let's partition the land up where the Jews live. We'll make that Jewish territory. Where the Arabs live, we'll make that Arab territory. But you can see on this map that it's a very unwieldy border. You have the Arab section split into 3 pieces, and also the Jewish section split into 3 areas. So it was a very awkward and unworkable division, but they approved it in 1947, the UN General Assembly. But the Arabs never did approve it, even though the Jews did.